There's an exciting area of economics known as environmental economics, where we use the principles of the marketplace to address some areas that up till now haven't really been thought of in terms of supply and demand. And one of those things is pollution. So we often think about carbon dioxide as being a natural, and it is a natural part of breathing. We're breathing out carbon dioxide, and carbon dioxide is part of the natural atmosphere and so forth. But carbon dioxide is also a greenhouse gas, and it's also a byproduct of the burning of fossil fuels, and it's contributing in its way to global climate change. So there's some folks that think that if we had less carbon in the atmosphere, then we would have less climate change. And an objective of the tax on carbon then would be to try to address global climate change. So let's take a look at what we're talking about here. There's some keywords that you might want to look up. Cap and trade. The Kyoto Accord is what we're discussing right here. It's named because the agreement or accord of the nations of the world who came together in Kyoto, Japan, brought about a kind of a world agreement that not all members nations signed, but that was agreed upon as a way of taxing excess production of carbon dioxide. Everyone is allowed to make some amount of carbon dioxide because, after all, this is a natural output of human activity. But if you're a nation that's making more than its share of carbon dioxide, then you would have to pay a tax to the national body that would then use that money and redistribute it among those member nations that were not making more than their share. Also, it would try to address, it would provide funds to address global climate change. The Copenhagen Conference of 2009 updated the Kyoto Accord of 10 years before. Abatement is a term that we use to generalize all the efforts to try to reduce or do away with pollution. Climate change, externalities, that is, an externality is the economic term that we use for pollution. It is when someone burns fossil fuel, let's say you're driving your car to get to a place, the cost of buying the gas and maintaining the car and so forth were things that you had to pay. So that's an internality. But the damage that's done by the burning of the gasoline to the environment that's paid by other people, that's everyone else who lives on the planet, that's an externality. So other examples of externality would be, let's say, if they can be positive, like I'm practicing my music and people that are nearby can hear me play. That it's not an intended output that strangers would hear what I was playing, but it is in fact a positive externality. Or when my neighbor is grilling, I can smell the delicious food that he's cooking. That's a positive externality. But if I was burning tires or I was manufacturing some um, noxious chemicals in my trailer, the off-putting gas that came from my exercise of activities would in fact be a negative externality. Carbon dioxide we've discussed. Incentives we always are interested in. Marginal cost, marginal benefit, key part of this. We'll come back to that. Cost minimization is a key idea of efficiency. Pollution tax is what the Kyoto Accord is all about. A permit market allows people to buy and sell permits for making carbon dioxide. So if you think about it, if you say that you're permitted to make carbon dioxide, then if you don't make the carbon dioxide, you might you've actually not done something that you were permitted to do. So some nations of the world are underproducing the carbon dioxide that they're permitted to do, and in so doing, they're actually could be rewarded by taking on some of the carbon dioxide of another country. So if I was, let's say, Germany, and I had extra carbon dioxide that I was making, let's say I was allowed to make 10 units of carbon dioxide, but I'm making 12, then what I might do is find some country that's making less than their allotted amount of carbon dioxide and ask them to take on the burden of my carbon dioxide. In other words, I'll pay them directly to accept 2 of the carbon dioxide units that I am producing. In so doing, that country is rewarded for staying clean. That country is incentivized to maintain its low carbon output. And instead of being incentivized to, say, cut down its rainforests or to take on a very noxious pollution causing plant of some sort, which it's currently incentivized to do. Instead, it's incentivized to stay clean, and that nation's cleanliness is rewarding to itself. So and that kind of change up in the incentive structure is what the permit market is all about. We're also looking at diminishing marginal returns, increasing marginal costs, and options. Okay, here's the scenario. You've got this complicated looking chart here, which is showing the output of pollution by Japan. Now, in the first line, we see that if Japan produces 20 units of pollution, then they are not abating any pollution. So they're running at full maximum pollution output. And they're not intending to make pollution. They're actually making energy, and they're making all sorts of neat things. But their byproduct of their positive endeavor is that they're also making 20 units of carbon dioxide. Since they're not doing any abatements, the cost of doing abatements is zero, and the total cost of abatement is zero. That's how you read that. So if Japan wanted to do an abatement effort, they could reduce the amount of pollution that they're doing, but it comes at an expense. They could, for instance, they could switch to some cleaner type of coal, and that would mean that their cost would increase by 21, and their pollution would reduce down to 19. So the little note here says that their current pollution level is 20, but they have the ability to lower their pollution level. They could lower their pollution to 17 or to 15 or to 10 even, right? But if they were to lower their pollution output, it would mean that they'd be spending money to do an abatement. And each abatement is more expensive than the next abatement, right? So the cost abatement varies with the type of abatement project. Switching to cleaner coal might be $76. Installing solar panels might cost $54. Constructing a subway system costs $208. Any project has the same net benefit because any one abatement reduces their output of pollution by 1, but some methods of abatement are less expensive than others. Some are easier to do than others. And so what Japan has done is put the easiest, lowest cost abatements first, and the more expensive, high cost abatements down here. It's possible, but extremely expensive and inefficient to reduce pollution down to very, very low levels. So they've ranked them from lowest to highest. That should make sense to you. And then over here, I've made things easier for you by giving you a total cost of abatement by just adding these numbers together. For instance, if Japan does 2 abatements, they're doing the $21 abatement and the $32 abatement for a total of $53. If they do 9 abatements, their 9th abatement cost $109. Their total amount that they've spent on abatements is $585. That's how you read this chart. Now, actually, as it turns out, Japan has another option. They could plant trees. If they plant oak trees absorb carbon dioxide, and the absorption of the carbon dioxide by the oak trees, these new oak trees that have been planted, will in fact absorb some of the carbon dioxide. So every tract of oak trees planted has the same effect as not having produced the carbon dioxide at all. If you imagine if you produce the carbon dioxide, so the pollution is still there, but it gets absorbed immediately by the trees that wouldn't have been absorbed before had you not planted the trees. And so Japan has a choice. They could either, let's say, do an abatement for $21 or plant trees for $61. Obviously, if that was the choice, they would be further ahead by spending a lower cost alternative and not making the pollution at all. But if they keep on doing abatements, then the cost of abating rises. And eventually it gets to a point where the cost of doing an abatement is more than the cost of planting the trees, and it would make more sense to plant the tree for $61 than to do an abatement for $65. So if I said to you, what's the most efficient way for Japan to reduce their total carbon footprint? And you'd say, well, it would be at first, it would be abatements up to a certain point. But after 4 abatements, it would be better to plant a tree. And then after they planted the first tree for $61, they should come over here and do the fifth abatement for $65. Then they should do the second tree for 72 before they do the sixth abatement for 76, and back and forth like that until they've gotten to a point where they stop spending money on that issue because the amount of pollution that they're producing is acceptable. Right now, we'd say that the amount of pollution that they're creating is really having a detrimental effect on society. So we don't like the fact that Japan is producing 20 units of carbon dioxide. But we do like all the cool stuff that's coming out of Japan, and the Japanese people are benefiting from the production of all the things that they're doing, but the pollution is a problem. So how best to address it is what the Kyoto Accord was trying to address. Over here I have a little note too. You have a copy of this so you can look at these notes as well. The cost of planting trees gets more expensive with every new tract because if we knew that we had tracts of trees to plant, we would, and some of them were more expensive than others, we would do the easiest, lowest cost trees first before we got to the expensive trees last. So that's why we have the law of increasing marginal cost. Okay, so with those two things in mind, trees or abatements, we realize that Japan has agreed to abide by the Kyoto Accord. Japan has a current pollution output of 20 units, and Japan, this is some new information, Japan is allocated 10 permits. Now that means that they're allowed to make 10 units of carbon dioxide. Each one of those permits covers 1 unit of carbon dioxide, which is, so they're allowed to make 10, but they are currently making 20, which means that they're going to have to pay a pollution tax of $100 per unit that exceeds the permitted levels. Now, permits are transferable, so they could buy permits from someone else. But right now, if they don't buy any permits from anyone else, and they don't reduce their production, and therefore don't reduce their pollution, if they don't do any abatements and they don't plant any trees, well, they're just going to have to pay $100 per unit above it. So we can calculate that out. If you said, okay, they're making 10 too many, $100 per unit, that's $1,000 they'd have to pay in as a tax. Okay. So each tract of trees will absorb a unit of carbon dioxide, which saves the cost of using a permit or paying the tax on one of the pollution items. And Japan can reduce its pollution output through abatement programs, so which you implied, but now it's said expressly. Hopefully this is making sense to you. So now we come down to some questions, right? And I created this little visual here because what we're really getting at is if you're Japan, what's the best choice or combination of choices for this country? Is it just produce the pollution and pay the tax at $100 per? Is it better to do an abatement and reduce the amount of pollution that we're making? Is it better to plant trees or pay to have them planted to absorb the carbon dioxide that you're making? Or is it better to buy permits in an international auction from another country that's not using all of their permits? Let's say a neighboring country is also allowed to make 10 units of carbon dioxide, but they're only making 7. Well, that would mean they have 3 permits that they might be willing to sell to us. But other countries also want to buy those permits, so we'll have to pay a price that's competitive with other countries that are also trying to buy those permits. So figuring out the answer to that question, right? The country is making more pollution than they're allowed, so should they pay the $100 tax, or should they plant trees, or should they do an abatement? The reason why those are all equivalent is because 1 permit is equal to 1 unit of pollution, which is equal to 1 tree tract, which is equal to 1 abatement, right? In these scenarios that I give you, this one I'm going to talk all the way through, but the one that I'm giving you to do yourself, it mirrors this one. I give you Germany instead of Japan. Okay, but this is Japan, so let's go ahead. Using the tables above to answer the following questions, how much will Japan pay in pollution tax if they don't abate or plant trees? Now you can follow along in your own sheet, but I've figured out the answer here. 10 units of CO2 is too many, and that will cost you $1,000. So the answer to question 1 is $1,000. Question 2, considering the optimal alternative available without purchasing another country's permit. You say, what do you mean optimal alternative? And you say, here we have to go to where we get into the real thick of it. What should Japan do? And at this point you can say, well, if they can solve this problem for less than $1,000, it would be an improvement. And if they can get down to the lowest possible price that Japan would have to pay, that will be the optimal choice. So right off the bat, it should make sense to you that if they're trying to avoid a $100 tax on carbon dioxide, that it would make sense to them to pay less than $100 for an abatement. So any one of these abatements that are less than $100 are possible choices for them to do. But like they could do 8 abatements, for instance, for the 8th abatement would be $98, but the 7th abatement is $87. So a total of cost of doing 8 abatements would be $476. But the key idea is the marginal cost of the 8th abatement. They could have spent $98 to avoid paying a $100 tax. Over on this side, they could do as many as 4 trees. Since trees are, these trees, the 5th track of tree and beyond is more than $100. It doesn't make sense to pay $100. To pay, say, $127 to plant trees just to avoid having to pay $100 in tax. But it does make sense to plant the 4th tree. However, there's this constraint that they only have to take care of 10 excess permits. See, if they do 8 abatements and 4 trees, then they're actually taking care of 12 problems. And they only need to take care of 10 problems. It wouldn't be necessary. So then the question is it better for them to do, say, 7 abatements and 3 trees? Or is it better for them to do, say, 4 trees and 6 abatements, or some combination that it would add up to 10? To figure that out, you would just compare the marginal cost, right? So the marginal cost of the 7th tree is $87, and the marginal cost of the 3rd tree is $83. So of the two, right, it makes sense that you should do at least 2 trees and you should do at least 6 abatements. But now you've got 2 more to do. So should you do the 7th tree for $87, or the 7th abatement for $87, or the 3rd tree for $83? Which one would be better to do? And better to do the $83 tree than the $87 abatement. So now that you've decided that you've done 6 abatements and 3 trees, so now your choice is, should you do the 4th tree or should you do the 7th abatement? And the answer is you should do the 7th abatement. So the optimal alternative is to do 7 abatements and 3 trees. The answer, therefore, of the cost of this alternative is $594. That's the cost of 7 abatements and 3 trees. So what's Japan's optimal level of abatement? It is 7. So what does that mean Japan's optimal level of pollution is? And it says, well, it must be that if they were making 20 and now they've abated 7, that their optimal level of pollution is 13 units of pollution. 13 units created, and 3 of the tree tracks that they planted then absorb 3 of those. So the total effect on the environment is as if they had only put in 10, but they're actually making 13. But they have if you're familiar with movies, they might say, or a carbon neutral endeavor, that they acknowledge that they're making carbon, but they're also doing something to offset the carbon they're producing, so that the total effect, net impact on the environment regarding carbon anyway, is 0. What's the total cost of trees Japan will decide to plant? The answer is 216. So if you're wondering where they got these numbers from, you come on up here. 3 trees is 216. Over here, the total cost of 7 abatements is 378 plus 3 trees of 216. adds up to the $594 that I had shown before. Let me see. Is that, yeah. Okay. What's Japan's maximum willingness to pay for a single permit? So you'd think that the answer would be they are willing to pay up to $100, but to avoid having to pay $100 tax. But since the most expensive thing that Japan is doing is either the seventh abatement for $87 or the third tree for $83, right? That if they were to buy a permit from another country, that what they'd be doing is avoiding having to plant this or do this seventh abatement. And therefore, they're willing to buy a permit for up to $87. But if they had to pay $87, it would be better for them just to reduce pollution rather than pay the $87 to another country. So what's Japan's maximum willingness to pay for a single permit? Answer, $86. A little less than what the most expensive abatement cost. These other questions have to do with, suppose there's more than one permit available, and you were, instead of auctioning off one permit, there were a bunch of permits to buy, and in fact they were all selling for $75 a piece, right? So even though the tax implied by the Kyoto Accord was $100 a piece, the permits are available for $75 a piece. So really the cost that Japan is now confined by is the $75 permit. So it doesn't make sense for them to do anything that costs more than $75. Just like it didn't make sense for them to spend more than $100 to avoid a $100 tax, it doesn't make any sense for them to spend more than $75 to avoid having to pay a $75 permit. Now they're buying the permit from another country instead of the government, but that's it's still the same confined optimization. So what we have here is the things that they were thinking about doing, like the $87 abatement or the $76 abatement, are no longer feasible. It would be better for them to buy 2 permits instead of doing those 2 abatements. They'll still do 5 abatements, the ones that cost less than $75, but they won't do the abatements that are expensive now. Over here, the trees that they'll plant the inexpensive trees, but they won't plant that third tree anymore. They'll buy 3 permits for $75 each. That will bring their total cost down. It'll be more efficient. And it'll also transfer dollars from a country that's a polluting country to a country that's not polluting. So if there's a large supply, right, you won't want to pay more than $75. Japan will buy 3 permits and only pay for 5 abatements. If the permits are available on the open market for $75 each, what's the cost to Japan of the optimal alternative? We can add it up. They pay for 3 permits or $225. They'll do 5 abatements for $215, and they'll plant 2 trees for $133. Now the total is $570. They've saved themselves $26 by doing it that way. This is creating the marketplace for pollution, and it really does create an incentive structure which internalizes these costs. If there were only 2 permits for sale, what's the maximum combined price Japan is willing to pay for the pair of permits? Now this one often leads to a good discussion in class. I'm going to explain the way I think about it here. $164 is what I said. Now the first impulse that people often said if they didn't give it a whole lot of thought is they figure that someone is willing to pay $200 for the 2 permits. But what you're really doing when you come on up here is you say, well, if I bought 2 permits, I mean, remember, we're back to the scenario where we're doing 7 abatements and 3 trees. So buying 2 permits allows us not to have to plant the tree and not have to do the abatement. So you'd think that you'd be willing to pay $87 plus $83 or $170. But I don't think so. Because if you were going to pay $170, you wouldn't buy permits with it. You would just do the abatement and do the tree. So then you might say, oh, yeah, that's right. If I were to do that, maybe I would be willing to pay $1 less than that amount. But if you actually had the permit, you wouldn't use it for the $83 tree, right? If you bought the permit, right, you're not actually willing to pay $86 for the permit when you already have a permit, because you're going to have two permits. So think of it this way. Suppose there were 10 permits that Japan could buy. Wouldn't they buy all of them for less than $20 or less than 21? Because it doesn't make sense for them to pay more than $21 for a permit, then that would only offset the 21. If they're going to definitely use all the permits that they're buying, which they're going to buy both those permits, then they're going to pay less than the cheapest thing that they're saving money on, which is the 83. So they're willing to pay $82 for both permits, or for each permit, and so that would be $82 plus $82, or $164 for the two of them combined. If it plays out well in the experiments that we do, and we see that happen in the marketplace as well, but it's not intuitive. So you might want to come back to that and think about it, discuss it with me, or include it in the discussion board. Experiment with the variables to determine the effect on pollution output, permit prices, and expenditures and revenue. So we complete those 7 questions, really addressed it. But what I do here is I play around with this. Like, how would it change things, right, if you allow an increase of pollution levels to 21? Instead of allowing only 10, suppose you allow 21 units of pollution. Say, well, if Japan is allowed to make 21 units of pollution, they're only making 20. They won't do any abatements, and they won't plant any trees, right? They might even increase their output of pollution. So if you're not careful with the, even though the structure of the Kyoto Accord allows for incentives to reduce pollution, you could create some perverse incentives as well. Suppose Japan is only allocated 7 permits. How would that change things? Well, then up here, all of a sudden, some of these things, like the 8th abatement, makes sense to do that. And over here, the 4th tree makes sense to do that as well. But it still doesn't make sense to spend $105 to plant trees just to avoid a $100 tax. You would just, instead of planting the tree, you would pay the $100 tax instead. So the answer for this one would be that 7 permits means 3 less permits. Japan would want to avoid paying $100 for those 3, so they'll have to find lower cost alternatives. And they would choose to do another tree, and they would do another abatement. And then therefore their costs would go up because the permit levels went down, but their pollution output would also reduce as well. So this is how they kind of eased things in with the design of the Kyoto Accord. They gave everyone a kind of a generous pollution permit at first, and then on track to reduce the amount of permitted pollution output that they're allowed to do, or not allowing it to grow. If the pollution tax was only $33 a unit, how would that change things? Well, go ahead and pollute all you wanted to, because it's not really a punishment, is it? If you only have to pay $33 per pollution unit, then the tax is too low, and the effect on marginal behavior will be slight. Suppose a firm offers to reforest the Amazon on behalf of Japan for $50 per tract of trees. In other words, if you as a reforestation or an environmental activist bought into this idea of the Kyoto Accord, you realize that Japan is facing extremely high costs of planting trees, but you have the ability to plant trees on their behalf for a much lower price than they have. Then they would be willing to pay you a very large, for as many tracts of trees as the market will bear, and that would fund your production of the trees. You understand that now Japan, not only would they rather have you, they would rather pay you $50 to plant trees than plant trees themselves, because all their trees are very expensive, taking up precious resources. But you could do it in an area that makes a lot of sense to everybody involved. But also, some of their abatement efforts would now be impractical. They would perhaps return to higher levels of pollution output, but pay you to have trees that would absorb that carbon dioxide. What I write here: the Amazon rainforest will return. Japan will find a $50 cost very competitive with most of the expensive abatement and domestic tree programs that they have. And then, what does Japan gain or lose from signing the accord? Well, an excellent question, if I do say so myself. That's a good one for open discussion. Thank you.